and welcome back, everybody, to High Strangeness. We are featuring for episode 4 today a conversation on hypnosis. Some of the topics we're going to cover is trauma, what it is, how it affects our body, what exactly is hypnosis, and
a bump in the night, a ferocious fright. You grab your oracle cards, the Ouija board, and knock at the door. You've heard this before. Welcome to High Strangeness with your host, Sadhu Dam and Sifu Aman Berry, diving into all subjects spiritual, paranormal, metaphysical, answering questions from students and listeners, and providing expert discussions on varying topics pertaining to high strangeness.
a gazelle is running across the plains, and suddenly a lion strikes from the bushes, and the gazelle tumbles to the ground, barely escaping. The gazelle, once out of danger, begins seizing and convulsing, twitching for a minute before getting up and prancing away like nothing happened. In nature, all animals are in sync and process trauma and release it from the body immediately following the ISE, or initial sensitizing event. Humans are a different story. Modern society has led us to repress and contain trauma in the neurology of our bodies, which create trauma packets that leak through the conscious mind but are playing on loop in the subconscious 24/7. Trauma is defined by any singular event that disrupts the 4F trauma response of fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. The disruption of this process is what locks that unplayed sequence of hormonal release in the body. This can lead to mental imbalances, anxiety, PTSD, depression, and numerous physical disorders as well. Looking at you, lupus. Many of these issues are psychosomatic, which means connected by mind and body, not meaning it's all in your head. What affects our mind will affect our body too. The common misconception most people have when it comes to trauma is in assuming that it has to be something akin to being in war or being brutally raped. Trauma can be as simple as being a teenage boy getting rejected by a girl he has a crush on, or even a child having their favorite toy taken away from them. The reason these are traumatic events is because anything that the body receives as a threat to its well-being, mentally, emotionally, or physically, is enough to create a trauma packet. Aman, would you like to share something on trauma?
Yeah. So you covered a lot of good science there. A lot of really in-depth stuff. For those of you who might be new to this, there's you might need to do some extra reading to understand some of those terms. Overall, the body keeps the score. Anything by Brent Baum, David Snyder, Tom Silver, like a lot of people have covered this stuff.
Aman, when we're talking about an initial sensitizing event, something that happens and takes place that traumatizes a person, maybe the first time your father yelled at you, or getting in a scary car crash. How come some people seem to bounce back from those experiences while others who have the same exact experience seem to be affected for years to come?
Well, there are a lot of factors that come into play with that, right? There is their natural predilection, the coping mechanisms that they have developed through life prior to that event, whether or not they have tested themselves in any real way, whether or not they have realized in themselves they have the ability to overcome adversity. What breaks one person completely can be completely different than what breaks another person completely. So there's never really any sense in comparing trauma because it's all conditioned based off our own neurology. That leads to another point that when people are like, hey, this happened to me, therefore what happened to you is not that bad, but you don't live in that person's neurology. When it comes to bounce back time, it really has to do with the body's natural mechanism to process it. So I guess to answer your question directly, is that mechanism allowed to happen or not is the determining factor.
Are we saying that all bodies are not equal in experience, even though the subjective reality is that a physical human body is a physical human body? We have the same nerves, the same organs, the same cells. What differentiates the ability to receive that experience different?
If you give a regular person like 3 regular people with no experience a mountain bike, and you put one of those people on like a really hard trail, one of those people on a regular city road, and one person on like a child's course, you might have different results, right? The mountain bike analogy is the ability to handle trauma with skill is a learned response that is modeled in childhood and often not modeled in child. It should be modeled by adults who model what it looks like to self-regulate when in a traumatic state. So what I do when I'm triggered is, number one, don't act on the trigger. Like literally earlier today, I was in a situation with my wife where I said something kind of snarky, and then I was like, I'm incapable of being as kind as I'd like to be. So I apologized, and I removed myself from the situation. I felt that trauma response taking over. We all have the ability to observe, process, and breathe through our trauma responses. That's also all of our responsibilities. We all have the same hardware, but not the same software. We have different operating systems.
When we're talking about these trauma packets, they're a direct response to locking trauma in our bodies and are meant to contain it further and to be released at some point. And the only reason why they're contained is so that we can cognitively function. But oftentimes we don't do that, and we end up stacking more traumas upon the original to the point where we become consciously aware that something is wrong. Take, for example, let's say you're in a horrific car crash, and the first instinct that your body has is to remove itself from the wreckage, to remove itself from the danger, to assess the damage to your organism, to your body. And then after that has happened, the natural response should be to shake, to cry, to scream, to release that emotion captured inside of the body. But if we're talking about this same car crash, and then afterwards, that person just goes to work like nothing happened, even though on the outside they're presenting as fine, and maybe their injuries are pretty minimal, and they were able to return back to work. But let's say now, fast forward a month after that, and they never processed that car crash. Why, when they're at a traffic light and there is nothing happening and they're in this car, all of a sudden they start having a panic attack?
We have 3 options when it comes to trauma. We have and really any emotion. We have suppression, expression, and transmutation. So to answer the question about the sitting in the light at the car and getting that panic attack, well, it's I don't want to say it's an obvious answer. It's pretty clear that the body in that moment feels safe enough to bring up. That's why a lot of people who are traumatized actually can't meditate right away, or they can't go into these more relaxed states, because they've associated going into relaxation as being re-traumatized, because they don't realize that it's just their body giving them the opportunity to do what is natural for it. In this instance, it's transmutation. In order to get through the event, they suppress the trauma. Or another outcome could be they're sitting at that same traffic light and their kid drops some ice cream on the seat, and they just have a complete meltdown and just snap at the kid. That would be a negative expression. Suppression, where the explosion happens internally. Expression, where the explosion happens externally. But transmutation, when the explosion is funneled into a laser beam and used for good.
We would call this, in a controlled matter, in a clinical setting, a abreaction, right?
Well, it'd be called an abreaction in a clinical setting. A lot of times, if it happens in a non-clinical setting, it's verbal abuse. I've actually had 2 emergency sessions in the past week, both of which were trauma-related. One of which today was a minor who, I'm not going to go into details, but at 1 grade, I taught this minor how to transmute their internal suppressed rage and trauma, by scooping it up, offering it to either the sun or moon, and receiving light in. It's like literally Qigong level 1. It prevented a hospitalization event.
With that, folks, we're going to start discussing a little bit of this hypnosis portion.
When we're talking about hypnosis, Are we talking about Eastern or Western hypnosis? Because there's a distinction. Are we talking about indigenous hypnotic practices? Hypnosis is such a broad term, and it's approached by every different culture in so many different ways. I think we should have some clarity as to the distinctions between them.
Okay. There's many misconceptions by the general public on what hypnosis is, as Amun pointed out. We often think of stage hypnotists making people turn into chickens, or they see it as a form of losing your mind entirely and being under the control of some villain from a 50s style movie with a pocket watch dangling in front and saying, "You're
Literally
feeling
me.
very sleepy."
Literally, it's me. I'm
Right.
that villain.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but is it not actually a very old healing art that originated around 14,000 years ago in the Vedanta sleep temples of ancient India?
Originally, and then it made its way to Egypt and Greece and other
And
things.
also Francis Mesmer of the Renaissance period, right?
Sure. So Mesmer is actually the Greek tradition through mesmerism would be considered Western hypnosis. Now, there's a discussion to be had about the Egyptian Kabbalistic influences of Western hypnosis, but that would be too deep for the purposes of this. We also have the indigenous hypnotic practices where, like in the Native American or in the Native traditions of all areas, after a traumatic battle, and let's say a brave came back from a hunting party or a war band, and they were deeply traumatized, the tribe would gather around them in community and perform what is a deeply hypnotic act called a soul retrieval, where their consciousness is guided to safely face what happened in that trauma. If we're talking in clinical terms, process and release the trauma packet, and then reassociate with being in the present moment, surrounded by their tribe. That would be tribal hypnosis. You want to talk on tribal hypnosis?
My understanding, there's a little bit of a difference in terminologies, but the point is the same and what is being achieved. In a Western context, we talk about fractured parts of the psyche or disassociated personality fragments. And in the Eastern or more indigenous styles of practice, in this same vein, we refer to these as soul shards,
Yeah.
or we refer to this as lost pieces of the
Yes.
spirit.
Same
But
phenomena.
we're talking about the same thing.
You're talking about the same phenomena. You're talking about a part of the human psyche that has been